Okay, so today's lecture is on the history of neural networks from 1900s to 1990s. But first, before we start, we need to flip a coin in order to decide how long I'm going to spend on each section. The reason will become clear afterwards. It's heads. Let's begin with a quote by Heraclitus. The thunderbolt steers all things. Now, Heraclitus meant by this that Zeus is the controller of all. However, I like to imagine that he meant it by saying that electric signals in the brains are the steers of all things. Another reason is that this neuron, which as we can see here, it looks kind of like a lightning. It is actually a pyramidal cell, which we will see momentarily. We begin our journey with somebody called Cajal. Santiago Ramon y Cajal was a Spanish neuroscience anatomist. And his main achievements was the discovery of neurons and the discovery that neurons signal in one direction instead of in both directions. He discovered this in a very interesting way. Under the microscope, he noticed that the neurons, they have an asymmetric shape, looking kind of like an arrow. And he inferred from this morphology that the neurons' functionality is in one direction. It's an early example of inferring functionality from morphology. He's also a great artist. These are drawn by himself. I really like his drawings, and they were found in beautiful old books that he published. Now, one important feature that Cajal's theory of the neuron is that all neural networks, all biological neural networks are feed forward, meaning that the signals only go in one direction. So for example, the signal from the hand reaches the sensory neuron, going to the spinal cord, to the brain, and then going back down there to the motor neurons to muscle motion. Except there's one exception that he discovered. I think that's the only exception in his entire corpus. This seems to be the first published observation of a recurrent network. He discovered it in the cerebellum. As we can see here, here's a neuron going in one direction, down here, up, and then down again. By the way, this is a pyramidal cell. We see it again now. This was published in 1909. It's very early. We will see more recurrent neural networks soon. A brief interlude, the vestibular ocular reflex, or VOR. So when we see a scene and our heads do not stay perfectly still, instead it can move all the time, even if you are not noticing it. However, the visual world that you see does not shake, even if your head is slightly shaking all the time. It is because of this VOR. So here we see how it works. Suppose your head tilts in one direction, immediately at the time scale of 10 milliseconds or so, the muscles of the eyeball turns in the opposite direction, almost perfectly canceling out this motion of the head. This starts stabilizing the visual world. As you can imagine, for VOR to operate, it has to operate really fast, which is going to have consequences in the neural anatomy that Rafael Lorente-Denot has discovered. Lorente-Denot was another Spanish neuroanatomist, and he was one of the best students of Cajal. Lorente-Denot discovered that in the brain stems of animals like rabbits and cats, there are those recurrent connections and also those residual connections. We will see more of residual connections as well. Here, residual connection means that a neuron goes in, it signals to another neuron, and then they go signal to the same nucleus, and so on. Now, interestingly, Laurent Denot reported this discovery to Cahal, and Cahal basically said, for the sake of your career, do not publish about recurrent connections because nobody would believe you. It was the received wisdom of the time that all the neurons, all the biological neural networks are feed forward only. So Denot did the obvious thing, which is to publish after Cahal died. He published it immediately in 1934, the year that Cahal died. Here I'm taking the pictures from a slightly later publication of 1938 because the pictures there look better. Lastly, in the section of the prehistory of neural networks is Donald Hebb. Donald Hebb was an American neurobiologist, and his main claim to fame is that he proposed a way of neural network learning called Hebbian learning, which you might have heard of as neurons that fire together, they wire together. And he discovered that but he published it in a big book called The Organization of Behavior in 1949. But the book is very big, and the book has a lot more more interesting content than just Hebbian learning. For example, here is another example of recurrent neural network, which he called reverberation in subnetworks or cell assemblies. Now the graph is a little confusing. So basically you can imagine this as a graph with 7 neurons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 6. And suppose this neuron is activated at this moment. It jumps here and then goes here and here and here and here, following the numbered arrows. Now, Donald Hebb proposed this kind of reverberation in cell assemblies in order as a theory of how short-term memories work. So for example, you're trying to remember a cell phone number just for long enough for you to make the call. So what you do inside your head is kind of like you're speaking to yourself, repeating the number again and again, once a second. Donald Hebb believed that these cell assemblies with those reverberating activations, they implement this kind of working memory. He also proposed that these reverberations implement other functions. So here, he's giving those recurrent network connections a kind of functionality, morphology implement functionality. Due to time constraints, I'm going to skip the part about cybernetics and go straight to the great paper of McCulloch and Pitts in 1943. This paper is very important because it's the paper that proposed artificial neural networks. Previously, in the part, we talked about the prehistory. The prehistory is basically all about biological neural networks and their morphology, how they are connected, and what their functions are. Here, around the 1930s and 40s, neurobiologists started to interest some mathematicians who are trying to propose mathematical theories of biological neural networks. McCulloch and Pitts, in this paper, they proposed the artificial neural network that we really use nowadays. Now, there are two people here. The first person is Warren McCulloch, who actually studied philosophy during his university days, and he still likes to call himself a neurophilosopher. And here's a quote by him that describes what his consuming interest was, which is, what is a number? That a man may know it, and a man that he may know a number. His collaborator is called Walter Pitts, and he's a logician with a And they met in 1941. Walter Pitts actually had a very bad upbringing, so he ran away from home and crashed, basically just went to University of Chicago on his own. And there he met McCulloch kind of by just going to the seminars and meeting mathematical neurobiologists. So they met and they started working on mathematical theory of thinking. They had very eclectic backgrounds. Walter Pitts was interested in cybernetics and causal loops and also formal logic, trying to formalize what it is that allows brains to do formal logic. And McCulloch was interested, he was working as a neurologist and psychiatrist. So he was interested in memory, learning, and hallucination, epilepsy, phantom pains, all those strange things. And they also went to the Macy conferences. The Macy conferences was important as an early, it's like back then there was no conferences on AI or neuroscience, but the Macy conferences was a conference that is for cyberneticians, which was like an earlier version of what we would call AI, control theory, neuroscience, all of them together. Deneau was there too, and Deneau got them interested in recurrent networks and causal loops. And that brings us to the McCulloch and Pitts paper, which proposed artificial neural networks. But first, what is the McCulloch and Pitts neuron? Here we see a single such neuron. It is essentially what we call an artificial neuron nowadays, except two things. One, all the neural connections, all the neural weights have to be an integer value. And two, all the activation function has to be a 0-1 function. So it can only output 0 or 1. So for example, here we see a single neuron. There's a synapse going in with 2, meaning that it is a plus, it has a weight of +2. This has a plus weight of +5. And this is a -1 weight. And here is the threshold, activation threshold, which is kind of like what we call bias, except the sign is like the opposite. And so suppose this neuron fires, then because it reaches the threshold, this would also fire. But if both of these fire, then because they add up together to 1, this does not fire. And therefore, this firing inhibits the firing of this. Basically, that is the McCulloch and Pitts neural network. A neural network is just a combination of these neurons. In this paper, they proved 2 very important results. The first result is that of universality. That is, they proved that any Boolean function can be computed by some kind of feed-forward network. Now, universality theorem is usually understood as saying that any real valued function that is smooth or at least continuous can be computed by some neural network. It was usually credited to a paper in 1988 by Cybenko, but here McCulloch and Pitts proved essentially the same result, except it's for discrete Boolean functions in 1943. Another very important result they proved is that feed-forward networks with Hebbian learning is equivalent to a recurrent network without Hebbian learning. Now, you might notice that this year is 6 years before Hebb published his book. That is, in fact, the idea of Hebbian learning was kind of in the air already. So what they meant by learning is this. At the start of a neural network, there are some synapses that are already active, but some synapses are not active. So here we see them as dotted lines. Now, in a learning, suppose this neuron activates and this neuron activates at the same time, then this synapse becomes active. So that in the next step, if this neuron activates, this has a weight of 2 instead of 1. What they showed is that this, which has learning in it, is exactly equivalent to this neural network, which has no learning, but this kind of synapse is implemented by this self loop. So they show that essentially they have learning, although they didn't put a lot of weight on learning because they show that it's equivalent to no learning. Here's an aside. As we remember that Cahal did not like causal loops. And in fact, causal loops essentially waited until the 1940s with their paper that it became acceptable. I don't have firm answers as to why causal loops was unacceptable for those decades, but I have some ideas. One is that reflexes are just simpler to study for neuroscientists. In a reflex, a neuroscientist can control what goes in and observe what comes out. But if there's a causal loop running in the brain, then you cannot really observe what the causal loop is doing. And it might suddenly have a behavioral response, such as the person suddenly stands up and walks away. And it seems like nothing seems to happen, but something probably happened in the brain, but you cannot observe it. Another reason is that feedback is just much harder to solve mathematically. In a feed-forward network, you can just start with the input and go layer by layer. But in a feedback mechanism, it's hard to know when to stop. And sometimes it's not even well defined what the output is. More philosophically, perhaps loops threaten the idea of linear causality, where a cause leads to an effect. And finally, it's probably a matter of luck that in the early 1900s, neuroscience and psychology was dominated by people like Cahal and Pavlov and Skinner, which we'll meet very soon, who all believed in a feed-forward kind of causal and do not believe in feedback loops. I also have a small comment that progress is possible even in theory. In the early 20th century, the brain was often analogized to a telephone switchboard. Here we see a telephone switchboard. So in a telephone switchboard, there's a line going in, and then in the switchboard, the line going in connects with the line going out through a switch, and that line goes out. As we can see, now neurobiological brains are usually analogized to an artificial neural network. Some commentators take this history and say that our analogies are not actually principled, that we're just taking whatever is the most advanced technology at this time, a kind of techno fashion, and use that to analogize the brains. However, note that telephone switchboards are feed forward, but neural networks are feedback. For example, the recurrent networks that you have seen. And I think this tells us that it is possible to make progress. There is progress. Heads. Now we get to the 1950s, where some proper neural networks are appearing now. During this period, there were two kinds of research on neural networks. One is in the construction of hardware neural network simulations. Another is the construction of software neural networks. But among the hardware neural networks, the most important one is Minsky's SNARK of 1952. So Marvin Minsky, which we'll see quite soon, but Marvin Minsky, he worked on, during his undergraduate years, he was interested in the behaviorist theories of B.F. Skinner. Now, B.F. Skinner is most famous for working with rats and mice and training them to perform all kinds of tasks like pressing levers or running in maze. Here we see a robot mice running a robot maze. just imagine this is an actual rat and you'll have the picture. Now, Minsky, he constructed an artificial neural network by basically constructing a lot of these SNARK neurons. This is a single SNARK neuron. It is, I've seen Minsky give a talk and he was holding this SNARK neuron in his hand. It's this big. And he had 40 of them. So it's about the size of a grand piano. After all, now in a SNARK neuron, the neural network is made by connecting each neuron to other neurons through basically electric wires with adjustable resistors or rheostats. And here we see a turning knob that when you turn it, it adjusts the rheostats. Now, because there are 40 of them and those things are so heavy, they also had a big electric motor connected to all those knobs by a chain. And so every time, and the whole thing is running a simulation of mice in a simulated maze. And so Minsky would watch the mice on an oscilloscope or something, a display. And every time the mice reaches the goal, he would press a button and the whole motor would start spinning up and turn all those synapses. And it will basically perform a kind of Hebbian learning with weight decay. And it was surprisingly effective. And that Minsky and his collaborators spent several days just mesmerized by this thing. Very productive procrastination. I'm sure we can all sympathize with that. We'll see Minsky very soon. But first, we'll look at the most important artificial neural network made by software and hardware. This is Frank Rosenblatt and his perception machine. Frank Rosenblatt was an American psychologist, and he did most of his work during a period of very productive 7 years, from 1957 to 1964. In his 1958 paper, he published The Perceptron, and he extended this to a whole book of over 600 pages in 1962. Now, first we should define what is a perceptron. A perceptron is what we would call a neuron, a binary neuron with a 0-1 activation function. So here is the formula for the perceptron. Theta is a 0-1 activation, meaning that if the input is less than 0, then it outputs 0. But if the input is greater or equal to 0, then it outputs 1. Rosenblatt both programmed perceptrons on electronic computers like the early IBM machines. He also constructed a purpose-made computer, which you can see here, which simulates perceptron networks at which is faster than the IBM machines of the time. Here we give an example of the kind of multi-layer perceptrons that Rosenblatt did. In this example, the first layer of the neural network is fixed, and we have the S units where the S stands for sensory, and the input neurons go, and each sensory neuron goes into the first layer of neurons called the A1 units. A1 stands for first association. After that, they go into the second layer, the A2 neurons, which stands for second association. And finally, it goes to the R units, where R stands for response. Notice two things. The first thing to notice is that some of these synapses are solid lines and the others are dotted lines. This is interesting. What he meant by solid lines is that this connections are fixed at the start and they are never changed. The dotted lines are weights that are changed. So if you look at this layer from A1 to A2, they are both solid lines that go directly from 1 to 1, and also dotted lines that go from every A1 to every A2. This we would recognize now as residual connections. So that's already residual connections way back in 1962. Another interesting fact to notice is that A2 neurons connect to the response neurons according to weight matrix or according to modifiable weights. Now, Rosenblatt did not train neural networks according to backpropagating errors because for the simple reason that 0-1 neurons, you cannot take a gradient usefully because the gradient is either 0 or infinite, so you cannot backpropagate derivatives. This will become a serious issue, and we will see that very soon. So what he did is that he had tried many different kinds of learning rules, none of which involved using derivatives. So for the A2 to R neurons, the learning rule is what he calls a perception learning rule, which is actually very similar to backpropagation if you have only one layer and if your neural activations are very close to 0-1, but not quite. Now, it works. He proved that it works, and he proved that it converges under some conditions, and it works in practice. But the problem is that in order to run it, you need to know what the inputs are and also what the desired outputs are so that it can calculate the difference between the desired outputs and the actual output. That is the error, and use that error to modify the weights. This works here, but what about here? You know what the inputs are to the A1, you just calculate forwards. However, you do not know what the A2 units should be because you do not have labels for what the A2 units should behave, because that has to be learned. And how do you learn what the desired outputs should be if you haven't even learned it yet? And you cannot use backpropagating errors because, again, you do not know what these are, and the activations are 0-1, so you cannot take the gradient. So what he did is essentially a Hebbian learning with weight decay again. So if both of these are active, then the weight here increases by an amount. And if not both of these are active, then it decays by a certain amount. In the book by Rosenblatt, there are a lot more than this. For example, here we basically see something what we would call a Hopfield network. Hopfield, you might have heard, has recently won the Nobel Prize in Physics. But here we see something very similar to a Hopfield network already. So what it does is that there are a lot of neurons in the middle layer, and they are connected to each other recurrently, so that when you have some sensory neurons, they go in, and you wait until this reaches some equilibrium, and then you read out the response. And here we see something very interesting. So Rosenblatt was a psychologist, and he wanted to model how the brains really do their job. So here we see two kinds of input. One is a photosensitive inputs, which basically means that it reads in pictures and converts them into binary pixels. And here are the audio sensitive units, which essentially means that it takes some audio and filters it and converts that into binary bits. And they both goes in and goes out. So that we have what we would call now a multimodal neural network. This is Rosenblatt's great project called Tobermory. It was trying to construct a neural network that can perform speech recognition, and it is named after a talking cat called Tobermory. It was a very big purpose-made computer. It has two hidden layers, just like the neural network that we saw previously. And it has a huge number, 12,000 weights, and it takes up an entire room. It was built during a period of 7 years, from 1961 to 1967. Unfortunately, when it was completed, it was already slower than simulation on IBM machines. This is kind of a theme that appears multiple times during the history of neural network research. That is, purpose-made hardware often ends up being slower than just running on generic electronic computers that are made for general purpose, like your laptop or later GPUs. But we'll go to the next. During the period of 1950s and 60s, not just Rosenblatt was doing neural network research. Another center of neural network research was the MINOS project at Stanford Research Institute, or SRI. The Stanford Research Institute was funded mainly by, the MINOS project was mainly funded by the military, and actually Rosenblatt's research was mainly funded by the Office for Naval Research, so there's also a military connection there. But here the MINOS project, the military connection is more direct. MINOS project was one of the main planned application of MINOS project is to perform character recognition for military applications. So for example, you have a photo, you have an aerial photo, and you want to recognize militarily interesting parts of it, like a tank or a ship, or you have a map, and then you want to convert the map into a digital map where symbols on the map are converted to their digital labels. Here we see an example of the machines built by the MINOS project. This is MINOS 2, built in 1963. It works like this. You first take an analog image, and then you use 100 optical masks. So what is an optical mask? Here we see an example of how MINOS is roughly supposed to work. Suppose you have an image here, and then you put a mask here with colors, with transparent parts and black parts. The image projects down here into a single photosensitive pixel. So for example, suppose this image has a lot of grid patterns, then this kind of checkerboard pattern, then this thing is going to have a very high value here. But if this source picture is more like a line or a cross, then the pixel is going to be very dark here. So this is essentially, it's kind of similar to how we would call a convolutional layer, except that the kernel of the convolution is the entire image. And also that every kernel is designed by hand. So a MINOS 2, you take an analog image, you convolve it into 100 binary bits. And then finally, you take a linear layer to 63 binary outputs. Note that in the first layer, there is no learning. All the optical masks are designed by hand. Only in the second linear layer is there a learning. Again, it is because there's no backpropagation. So in order to learn anything, you have to have both known inputs and known outputs. Here we see a weight matrix for MINOS 2. It essentially does a giant matrix multiplication for the second to third layer. I like to call it the world's first TPU because TPUs are tensor processing units. They do matrix multiplication really fast. And this thing is actually pretty heavy. So it's a real weight matrix. you can swap one out and put another in, and that's how you change what the machine's supposed to learn. The third important center for neural network research in this period was a group around Bernard Whitrow, and it's on Adaline, Adaline is for adaptive linear. Adaline means the circuit diagram of Adaline is shown here. Adaline is essentially the same as the binary perceptron, except for one difference. It has a different learning rule instead of the perceptron learning rule. Now, if we look carefully here, we see that the weight matrix, each weight, here the axes are the inputs, and each input is a binary switch. And every weight is constructed by a sliding resistor again, which is here. And here's the bias. Again, that's another sliding resistor with a constant input here. And finally, here is the reference switch, which is Y. So here we notice something very interesting. The output of the neuron goes in two directions. In one direction, it goes to the output by essentially a 0-1 function, even though here it's drawn as -1 + 1. But again, it's a binary output. But the learning rule is made it so that it basically does gradient descent on the squared error. And here is where the loss function is computed. The out error goes out here. Now, Adaline was also implemented by a purpose-made machine. In fact, we can see here the exact Adaline machine that they did. So first, what the machine is supposed to do. The machine is supposed to recognize whether an input pattern of 4x4 pixels, whether the input pattern belongs to a class or does not belong to a class. For example, here is here is a drawing of the letter T, and here is another drawing of letter T. Here's a drawing of G, and here's a drawing of F. So the Adaline can learn that these two are drawings of T, and these are not drawings of T. That's all it can do. And here is probably one of the first publications of a loss curve or a learning curve. So come back here. This is where the Adaline machine input is. It's made of a grid of switches that Whitrow would switch by hand. And here is the output. So here's the Y. Y is also switched by hand. So because back then you did not have large digital data sets, so in order to train an Adaline, Whitrow would just flip the switch by hand, flip the label by hand, and then he would perform the Adaline learning by hand. So here, each knob here corresponds to a weight here. And here's the bias, also is a knob. And here's the loss. So what Whitrow would do is to look at this voltage meter, which stands for the error, and he would turn all the weights and biases until the error reaches 0, according to the Adaline learning rule. It was really slow, but it was bad. It was state of the art, at least for the period. Of course, once you have an Adaline, you can consider what if you have a lot of Adalines, which brings us to Madaline or many Adaline. So if you remember, the Adaline has, even though the learning rule of Adaline is a gradient descent, the output of an Adaline is a binary, -1 or +1. So again, you cannot do back propagation because the activation function is not differentiable. However, they did try. Here is an example of a 2-layered Madaline. And the diagram shows a very complicated thing called a job assigner, which is essentially a kind of pretty hacky way to perform learning without doing backpropagation. Basically, they tried every single trick except gradient descent. This is going to be important later. The perceptron learning rule. Now we reached the 1960s and 70s. Winter has come. Here we see Marvin Minsky again. He's about to be very important now. A quote by him in 1990s in an interview. It would seem that perceptrons has much the same role as the Necronomicon that is often cited but never read. The perceptrons book, here we see two spirally patterns and here two square spirally patterns. These are book covers for the perceptron book for a reason that will become clear. But first, the Zohr myth. Now, you might, maybe in some introductory AI course, you have heard of the Zohr myth. According to the myth, neural networks were abandoned after a book called The Perceptrons by Marvin Minsky and Samuel Papert, published in 1969. According to the book, a single layer perceptron cannot even learn the Zohr function, the exclusive OR function. And so it was abandoned. However, it was revived in the 1980s after the development of multi-layer perceptrons, which can learn the Zohr function as well as any other function. Now, this is a myth for multiple reasons. The first reason is that the exclusive OR function is quite obviously impossible for single layer perceptrons because in an exclusive OR function, the input is divided into two classes that are not separable by a plane, and therefore a single perceptron cannot learn it. In fact, the first time I heard about the Zohr problem, it took me about 5 minutes to prove that this is impossible, and then another 5 minutes to design a two-layered perceptron that can learn the Zohr function, that can perform the Zohr function. That's one problem. The second problem is that in the McCulloch and Pitts paper of 1943, they already showed that multi-layered perceptrons are Turing complete because they can compute any Boolean function. So if you connect it to a read head, a write head, and a tape mover, it can perform any Turing machine you can speak of. And so, of course, the Zohr function can be computed. A third reason is that back then, electric engineers were hand designing MLPs. They called it linear threshold logic because it's a neuron with a binary output, and the input decides whether the output is 0 or 1 based on a linear threshold. So they were designing those MLPs as a kind of alternative to the transistor logic and other competing logic systems of the time. So if electric engineers were interested, surely they would have, if perceptrons cannot even solve Zohr functions, they would not be interested in doing this. Finally, we already saw that Rosenblatt, Widrow, and the Stanford Research Institute were all training multi-layer perceptrons in the 1960s. So what is the real story? I think the most important reason is that everyone just failed to train MLPs. Let's start with Rosenblatt. Rosenblatt actually, in his 1962 book, talked about something he called backpropagating errors. But it was not backpropagation as we know of because it's not gradient descent. He meant something like, you know the errors in the output, and then you use a heuristic rule to compute what the error should be in the penultimate layer and so on. Calculate another heuristic error, again, layer by layer from the output to the input. He also had considered continuous activation functions. He also had multiple trainable layers, which we saw previously, but somehow he just never put them together into a gradient descent. The other two groups did not fare any better either. Here is the Bernard Widrow quote in a 1994 interview. He said, "We never succeeded in developing an algorithm for adapting both layers. Backprop to me is almost miraculous. It's miraculous to just remove the -1+1 activation, indeed." Here's another quote from Niels Nielsen from the Stanford Research Institute. "I recall Charles Rosen, the leader of our group, sitting in his office with yellow Quadrille tablets, hand simulating his ever-inventive schemes for making weight changes. None seemed to work out." And now, Minsky and Papert. This is Marvin Minsky, and this is Seymour Papert. They met in 1963, and they started collaborating to basically just dunk on large neural networks. So the book came out in 1969, but before that, they were already circulating their working notes at conferences. They were also doing onstage debates with the neural network people. Here's a quote from a later interview. "Many remember as great spectator sports the quarrels Minsky and Rosenblatt had." Finally, they published their infamous book, Perceptrons, in 1969. So if I summarize in one sentence what the Perceptrons book is supposed to be, it's this. If you have a single perceptron, it doesn't do much because it's linear, because it has to be linearly separable in the inputs. If you have two-layer perceptrons, then since you can't train the first layer, then you have to featureize it. You can either hand design the features or you can randomize the features. But in either case, the machine still cannot do much because of combinatorial explosion and other difficulties. We will see more of what the Zohr problem is in the context of this book later. But first, we can ask, why did Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert want to dunk on large neural networks? So Minsky has a preferred approach to AI, which he calls a society of mind. Here we see a picture of what a society of mind looks like. At the bottom, there are some simple algorithms that perform easy tasks like noticing a line. And on the second layer, there are more simple algorithms that take the first layer's algorithms output as input and controls them. You can think of them as workers and managers over the workers and higher managers over the managers and so on, which makes the mean. He calls it a society of mind because that's what he believes the natural intelligence really work. Minsky saw that no general algorithm can scale to large problems, and you can only have specific algorithms performing specific tasks. A large neural network for everything is directly against the idea of the society of mind because it's one algorithm supposedly good for everything in intelligence. Here's a quote from an interview in 1981 with New York Times. "I had the naive idea that if one could build a big enough network with enough memory loops, it might get lucky. But either this was a bad idea or it would take thousands or millions of neurons to make it work. And I couldn't afford to try to build a machine like that." Yeah, 1,000 or 1,000,000 neurons was kind of too many. Back in the 1950s, with his 40 neurons already taking up the size of a grand piano, that's reasonable. But Marvin Minsky actually lived until 2016, and he still did not believe in large neural networks. And that's already after the deep learning revolution came. So it's kind of overfitting on his early experiences, as I would say. His collaborator, Seymour Papert, had a different motivation for rejecting large neural networks. So Seymour Papert actually believed that general algorithms are unjust and exclusionary to other ways of knowing. So for example, he thought that essentially everybody is entitled to their own ways to know how the world works. And he took it very seriously. Here's a quote from 1990s. A new computer culture would require a new social construction of the computer with a new set of intellectual and emotional values, more like those applied to harpsichords and hammers. Epistemological pluralism. That's the key word phrase here. Epistemological pluralism is a necessary condition for a more inclusive computer culture. Epistemological pluralism basically means that you have a lot of ways to know and none of them is the best. And if we have just one large neural network for everything, that's not very pluralistic. And so he argued against it. So Marvin Minsky clearly thought that their book was put a stop to those neural networks. So, however, I do not believe that their book really caused the neural network winter. For one, funding was already turning away from neural networks to the more symbolic methods, which also called logical AI approach. Two, there was a lack of people during this period, during this neural network winter. McCulloch and Pitts died in 1969 and Rosenblatt died in 1971. Bernard Widrow gave up on Madeline because they just couldn't get it to work. So he cut his losses and focused on Adeline instead. Adeline did work and he started putting Adeline everywhere in antennas and in telephones that adaptively filters out noise or antennas that adaptively filters out noise as well. He actually said that there are a lot of Adelines, tiny Adelines in iPhones. Ted Hoff, which was one of Widrow's best students and a collaborator in the Adeline research, he went to Intel and co-invented the microprocessor. The Stanford Research Institute turned to logical AI approaches. And finally, most importantly, there was no backpropagation algorithm. Which brings the question of why didn't they have backpropagation? Unfortunately, I think the most likely reason is that it's bad luck. The idea is very simple, but nobody actually got the idea. But there are also other reasons. One reason is what I call the fear of local minima. So if you read the history of neural networks a little bit, around the period before, let's say 2010, there's one objection that kept getting raised whenever somebody suggested backpropagation neural network approach to AI. That is, backpropagation is just gradient descent. And so it's probably going to end up in a local minima. But the local minima is not the global minima. Now, Marvin Minsky kept hammering this point. He kept saying that we have a problem here. I can design an algorithm, standard logical algorithm that provably reaches the best solution. Neural networks, you cannot guarantee this. This objection is pretty common. We will see more of that objection later. Even Geoffrey Hinton has that objection, at least for a while. Another thing is that everybody just knew that real neurons are binary. It's either activated or not activated. So artificial neurons must also be binary. And finally, I think that back then, people had a different perspective on what neural networks are supposed to be. They thought of neural networks as as a way to construct Boolean functions. So you have a binary, a grid. So for example, you have an image, which is a grid of binary pixels, either on or off, and you have an output, which is either the image is a letter A or it's not a letter A, and so on. So if you think of machine learning as synthesizing Boolean functions without you hand designing it, it's reasonable to use binary neurons since you're not going to use continuous inputs anyway. But I don't really know for sure. And I have written an essay going over the more details on backpropagation. Now, finally, there's a problem of why is there a Zohr myth? Now, the Zohr myth, the question, why, if we saw that the Zohr myth is not actually real, so why do people keep teaching the Zohr myth? I have a guess is that professors need to explain what happened during the 1970s in an introductory AI course, and the actual Zohr problem, which we'll present momentarily, requires some detailed work and requires one to already know what perceptrons do. But the Zohr problem, which is a single perceptron cannot perform the Zohr task, that is very easy to present. So professor just presented the Zohr myth and quickly go over and thus go over the history of neural network winter in 5 minutes. It saves time. But there is actually a Zohr problem, and it is this. I've drawn out basically what the Zohr problem is. Suppose I'm Marvin Minsky and I'm arguing against a neural network researcher. So I ask, can your neural network learn the Zohr function? Suppose they say no. Well, neural networks are useless then. But if they say yes, if there are 2 layers or multiple layers, I ask, well, how was it made? How is it made? So if they say, well, I designed the first layer, and then I learned maybe the second layer, or maybe I just designed the whole thing. That's it. You're a fellow scientist because you use your insights to do neural networks. You do not just throw a neural network with a general algorithm and hope that it will work. Now, if they say, well, it's learned on data, and I ask, what algorithm did you use? Here we have 3 possible replies. The first reply the third reply, that is gradient descent, actually is not available before the 1980s. So we have just 2 of these. Suppose they say, well, I use the perceptron learning rule. I say, perceptron learning rule, it works when you on the last layer, but it doesn't work on the previous layer. So where did the previous layers, how did the previous layers weights get computed? That is, where did the features going into the last layer come from? Well, they might say, I designed it. Then you are using inside again. Good. But suppose they say, well, I randomly generated the previous layer's weights so that the features going into the last layer were randomly generated. This is actually Rosenblatt's approach. Then I would reasonably argue that this is not a scalable approach because of combinatorial explosion. You would need exponentially many neurons in the next to last layer in order for this to work. And it's just not going to scale. Alternatively, if they did not use perceptron learning rule, they can try one of the many different learning rules developed by Widrow, Rosenblatt, and so on. So I ask, well, did it work? They would say, it worked on small problems. I told you that neural networks do not scale. In fact, no general algorithm can possibly scale. So, or maybe if I said, or maybe it works on large problems if I set the hyperparameters just correct. And I said, you see, this is another instance of the no free lunching learning. Every problem requires a different hyperparameter setting. This shows that no practical practical and general learning algorithm exists, you need to have a specific algorithm for a specific problem. But of course, this is not the last word on neural network. The winter is ending and the spring has come in 1980s. Here we see two book titles, one called Parallel. It's a 2-volume work of parallel distributed processing published in 1986. And it was essentially the focal point of a lot of neural network research in the 1980s. So spring has sprung in 1980s. So why did neural networks emerge again in the 1980s? Well, first, algorithm backpropagation got developed multiple times during the 1970s. But it took a while for them to be published and be generally known among neural network researchers, just as Paul Verbos, whose backstory we'll present soon. Another reason is that computing finally became cheap and widespread. Here we see the best mini computer of the period, the PDP-11. It was cheap enough that professors can reasonably own one, and it's fast enough so that you can run some non-trivial neural networks of around 10,000 synapses on it. This kind of compute back then in the 1960s was only available to people with government funding, like Rosenblatt with his funding from the Office of Navy Research. As an example of the strange backstory of backpropagation, consider Paul Verbos. Paul Verbos was doing a PhD in 1972, and strangely, he designed backpropagation because he was trying to mathematify Sigmund Freud's theory of psychic energy. And of course, his PhD thesis committee was unsure of Freud. They were also not sure of the math because it's probably a little difficult for them. So they told Verbos, you've got to prove some theorems first. For example, whether it converges and so on. So Paul Verbos had to find a supporting advisor. So he went around to look for supporting advisors. Oh wait, I forgot. Tails. So he first went to Steven Grossberg. Grossberg said, well, either it's already been done before or else it's wrong. I'm not sure which of the two, but I know it's one of the two. Great job for crushing his dreams by the rule of excluded middle. So he went to Jerome Ledvin, and Ledvin said, you're saying that there's motive and purpose in the human brain. That's because you are Freudian, but you cannot take an anthropomorphic view of the human brain. Ledvin was more of a mechanistic interpretation of the human brain kind of person. And he went to Marvin Minsky, and Minsky said, well, everybody knows a neuron is a 0-1 spike generator. Your model's totally crazy. Nobody's going to believe you. I'm not going to associate with you, and so on. So Verbos couldn't find a supporting advisor, so he went back to the drawing board and simplified his backpropagation to just piecewise linear activation. So what we call a ReLU neural network with backpropagation. Now PhD committee says, well, that's going to work all right, but it's too trivial to be worthy of a Harvard PhD. So Verbos lost funding for a few months and he was living in the slums. And he said, I remember getting the shakes from inadequate nutrition. But fortunately, he finally found a supporting advisor called Carl Deutsch, who actually wrote a book called The Nerves of Government, where he modeled government operations as a neural network. And finally, he did finish PhD in 1974. And the thesis contains the backpropagation. But this is they are rarely published and it's rarely read. And so he tried to publish, and after the thesis, he promptly went into government jobs, and it was a decade of misadventures working in the federal bureaucracy, from the Department of Defense to the Department of Energy, and just a lot of strange bureaucratic things happening that took him 8 more years before he could finally publish backpropagation in 1982 in a paper that is about modeling the energy market. And in the appendix, there's the backpropagation algorithm. But we usually do not, but when people cite backpropagation, they usually do not cite variables. They usually cite a paper in 1986 by Rumelhart, Geoffrey Hinton, and McClelland. So in order to understand the backstory of that, we will take a little side note in Boltzmann machines. In a Boltzmann machine, we have n neurons connected by wires, and we can understand the overall state of the system as a vector with entries being the states of the neurons. And the whole energy, and the system has an overall energy. Energy is basically just a real number that is a function of the state of the system. And the probability of the state system to be in state X is a function of this form, which you would be familiar with if you have taken a course in statistical mechanics. It's used by physicists all around the world. It has many beautiful theorems, and physicists love this. It has elegant theory. It's great. And in 1982, David Rumelhart rediscovered backpropagation and told Geoffrey Hinton about it. Hinton, as you might have heard, that Hinton has just won the Nobel Prize in Physics, shared with Hopfield. And Hinton resisted the backpropagation for 3 whole years. His first objection is that it couldn't break symmetry. So for example, if you have a neural network and all the weights are initialized to 0, then indeed, backpropagation would not allow you to break the symmetry in that. And Rumelhart said that, well, that's simple. You just randomly initialize the weights. So Hinton tried the second objection, which is that it gets stuck in local minima, unlike Boltzmann machine. And that's where his objection went, and he spent several years trying to get Boltzmann machines to work. But he found that Boltzmann machines, often when you train it on a large problem, it would, after training for a while, it would go sour. So he spent about a year printing out the training logs and inspecting it manually on paper until he finally realized that Boltzmann machines also get stuck in local minima. So in desperation, he decided to try backpropagation. That was 1985. So he asked his students in his research group, who would like to implement this? And students were thoroughly indoctrinated into Boltzmann machines, and none of them wanted to work on it and thus giving up immortality. So Hinton programmed it himself. And the first thing he tried was to try it on a very simple problem, which he calls an 838 autoencoder task. The idea is that you have an input which is a one-hot encoding of a number from 0 to 7. And then it goes into 3 neurons in the middle. And then it goes out, hopefully exactly the same as the input. The idea is that the neural network should learn to do binary encoding of the input. Hinton has tried this many times with Boltzmann machines. He knew all about what the weights should be after learning. So he trained it, and he noticed that the weights trained by backpropagation look wrong. So he thought, turns out backpropagation is not that good after all. And then he checked the loss function, and he realized the loss is 0. So he was finally convinced that backpropagation does work, and he published it. And that's the paper that everyone cites when they want to cite backpropagation. And of course, since there's a neural network spring, Minsky and Papert is not going to stay still. So they republished perceptrons in 1988 and added over 40 pages of commentary, making sure that you take the lesson and reject large neural networks. But it seems that people just ignored Marvin Minsky and Papert this time. And however, that is not actually the end of neural network winter. There's actually a second neural network winter around 1990s to 2000s, which I hope to present eventually. But let's give Minsky and Papert a little further note. In this book, they basically extended their Zohr problem to here. So remember that in the Zohr problem, we ended up here. They asked, what algorithm did you use to train your neural network? Now we have backpropagation. So you reply, backpropagation by gradient descent. And I ask, would the neural network get stuck in local minima? If the reply is yes, but it works in practice, then that's not science, that's engineering. Alternatively, yes, it gets stuck in local minima, but every general algorithm would get stuck in local minima. Boltzmann machines get stuck in local minima. Well, I say, give up your delusion of using one general algorithm for everything. You've got to design specific algorithms for specific things. Or you can say, local minima and the global minimum converge as the model scales up. And I ask, did you prove a theorem like that? Yes, in a toy model. Well, that's a toy model. The theory does not justify practice, which is not a toy. Or maybe, no, but I drew a scatter plot and the loss curve seems fine. That's not science, that's engineering, I guess. And we're at the end of the neural network winter. So I guess I can present a little bitter lessons. The first lesson is that it seems really hard to lose a good idea. You can't really keep a good idea down. That's what I would say. We've seen that, for example, backpropagation gets invented multiple times, and people will keep repeating the same ideas until it starts working, and then it will not be lost again. And Rumelhart and Geoffrey Hinton were not the inventors of backpropagation, but they get most of the credit. Not because they were the first inventors, but because they were the last reinventors. Because once the idea finally reaches the wider audience, nobody else has to reinvent it again. So it's the last reinventor that gets the credit. I like to say that it's kind of a subversion of George Santayana's famous quote. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And those who do not know of the best ideas of the past are condemned to reinvent them. Here we see a few examples of reinventions of good ideas. These are reinventions of the residual network. It was discovered in Laurent Denot in the 1930s. I'm pretty sure Cahal also discovered it, but I can't find it in his books yet. And here's Rosenblatt's residual network in 1961. Here's an interesting, very obscure paper in 1988 called Telling Two Spirals Apart. And here we see there's residual connections from every layer to every later layer. This is the ResNet paper of 1915 that everybody cites nowadays. This is the residual connection that you've seen. And finally, here's a paper called DenseNet in 2016. And doesn't that look exactly the same as the Two Spirals Apart paper of 1988? Here are reinventions of the recurrent network. And here are reinventions of the Hopfield network. Hopfield got a Nobel Prize for this. Rosenblatt in 1960, Nakano in 1971, and Hopfield in 1982. And another thing is that compute actually matters a lot more than ideas. Because ideas are easy to invent, and it's easy to invent elegant ideas, but something I call the Newton's third law of ideas. For every elegant idea, there's an equal and opposite one. There were many elegant arguments against backpropagation. But, well, as we know, backpropagation does work. So if you have so many elegant ideas, how do you tell which elegant ideas are better? Well, you run benchmarks, run them on big problems and see which one actually works out. But in order to run big benchmarks, you need a lot of compute. And so I would say good ideas are kind of like seeds waiting for the soil to compute, and then they will sprout. And finally, and there's also another direction. It's not just good ideas require compute to test. Sometimes good ideas require compute to even be discovered. Because if you have cheap compute, you can afford to run a lot of cheap experiments so that you can quickly ablate and find the better ideas. So here are two quotes. This quote is from a 2024 report on the invention of transformers. During the end, when the transformers paper of 2017 called "Attention is All You Need," as they were trying to finalize the paper, they tried to ablate every architecture of the transformer to reach the final form. Which one helps, which doesn't help, let's rip it out, let's replace it with this. All of these components of the transformer were the output of this extremely high-paced iterative trial and error. Trial and error, you don't see that in this paper, but it's there. Another quote, this is from a research blog by Microsoft researchers talking about how the ResNet paper of 2015 came about. For months, they toyed with various ways to add more layers and still get accurate results. After a lot of trial and error, the researchers hit on a system they dubbed deep residual networks. But if you go to the papers, you don't see the trial and error. They don't mention it. It's like, here's a good idea. It makes sense, so we tried it. But what they don't say is that we tried it, which ablated the hell out of it and finally reached this one, and it works great. And I said that it's kind of a bitter idea. So what is so bitter? Even with backprop, not much was possible in the 1970s. And I would say that Ted Hopf was right to leave neural networks for Intel to co-invent the microprocessor, which eventually gave rise to enough compute, which gave rise to the deep learning revolution. But how many are like him? Marvin Minsky, for one, never accepted large neural networks. He said in 1969, we have not found, by thinking about the literature, any other really interesting class of multi-layer machines. And in 2006, in a conference called AI at 50, he expressed his disappointment in AI research that you're not working on the problem of general intelligence, you're just working on applications. And here's Noam Chomsky, which is a very famous linguist with a lot of clout and influence in linguistics and general psychology. In 1969, he said, the notion of probability of a sentence is an entirely useless one under any known interpretation of the term. And of course, we know that what GPTs are, they literally assign probabilities of sentence. And of course, in 2022 interview, he said, large neural networks have achieved zero in terms of theory, in terms of general understanding of linguistics. GPT-4 will be exactly the same. You'll use even more energy and achieve exactly nothing for the same reason. So there's nothing to discuss. Well, even Geoffrey Hinton was quite unhappy with backpropagation. In 1995, an interview, he said, I was always a little bit disappointed. I mean, intellectually, backpropagation wasn't nearly as satisfying as Boltzmann machines. It's not just because I didn't think of it. I think it's because it didn't have the nice probabilistic interpretation. And in fact, he kind of stopped doing neural networks during the second neural network winter. And he kept doing something called deep belief neural networks, which is basically a multi-layer Boltzmann machine up until 2009. And so the bitter lesson continues. But it's not the end of history. I'm working on the history of the second neural network winter, which should appear this December and published on my homepage. And here are some further readings that gives all the details that didn't go into the slides. And that's the end of the talk. Thank you. Yes. You ask for a coin flip, I'll give you a coin flip. Tails.
Like, can you like draw a connection between like the perception we mentioned and like a support vector machine?
Support vector machines. Yes, so you can think of support vector machines as perceptrons with guaranteed margins between the separating planes.
Yeah, so like.
And usually you also have kernels. So usually support vector machines are not exactly linear. You run a support vector machine over features. It's called kernelized. And the features, at least during the second neural network winter, they were hand designed.
Oh, so like can you think of like for example MLP like in the early years like a combination of a lot of support vector machines that they learn together.
What do you mean?
I mean like can you think of like a simple neural network as a combination of like a lot of SVMs and all the SVMs they learn the data together.
Well, if you only have a lot of SVMs, then you just have one layer with many inputs. In order to have something like deep learning with learned feature, you need to learn more than the last layer. And for that, you need backpropagation.
Yeah.
And of course, and in fact, support vector machines, they were state of the art, at least during the second neural network winter. And they were usually not used in combination with neural networks. What?
How do you think of like the Bayes deep learning?
What?
Like the Bayes neural networks.
You mean the deep belief networks?
I mean like the Bayes network, like Bayes deep learning something like, for example, you have some prior beliefs of the brain neural network. Yeah, Bayesian deep learning.
Bayesian deep learning there was some work during the 1990s on using Bayes' approach to neural networks. It was called neural networks as Gaussian processes. However, the conclusion of the time was that, yes, it works, but it works even better if you just directly design Gaussian process without going through the neural network. And that's actually what they did. In fact, I'm going to write about it in this history of the second neural network winter. Hopefully, I gathered like 100,000 words of old paper clippings and stuff. It's pretty hard to write because it feels like writing a history of nothing because so little happened, but yet a lot had to happen in the background in order for so little to happen. I'm trying to write a history of nothing, and it's like painting a picture of negative space. Hopefully it will be interesting.
So one last question, like how do you think of like you mentioned, like deep learning is someone not like a science, but like an engineering.
Yes.
From certain aspects, like then how do you think that from this standpoint, that how do you think of the interpretability of like very architectures such as a transformer? Like, do you think that there is a way for us like to interpret this behavior and also like to understand how it fails and how it's
You're asking about
like interpretation of neural networks.
You're asking about you're asking whether I think mechanistic interpretation of neural networks is successful for making better neural networks. Is that the question?
No, I mean like, do you think that we can like interpret like the mechanism behind those neural networks and how can we proceed?
That is not something I'm going to write about in the history of neural networks. But the desire for interpretable neural networks is, I believe, always in the background during those early years. Is, for example, Chomsky and Minsky. They basically argue that you cannot claim that neural networks are going to scale because just by showing that it works empirically. You have to prove that it works. And in order to prove something works, you pretty much have to mechanistically interpret it from the get-go. So the desire for mechanistic interpretability, I would say, hindered the neural network research for a long time. As for whether it is going to be useful for making better neural networks, it remains to be seen. Fate will decide. Okay, that's the end.
Next up.